I'm Megan Carpenter. I'm Dean of the UNH Franklin Pierce School of Law, and we are so happy to have you here with us this afternoon. You know, it's funny, people ask me all the time. I've lived in New Hampshire now 2 years, and 2 years and 3 months, technically. And people ask me, what's your impression or what's your favorite thing about New Hampshire? And far and away, my favorite thing about New Hampshire is the level of civic engagement we have at every turn and every corner. And this turnout today is certainly a sign of that. And we are honored to have you here with us today. And we are honored to be your law school. So thank you for being here. So thank you for being here. I'm going to turn it over to Professor John Graby. He is the director of the Rudman Center for Justice, Leadership, and Public Service. And he is responsible for working with the ACLU to bring these incredible events to you today. Thanks so much, John.
Thank you. Thanks, Megan. Welcome, everyone. And I also want to actually acknowledge my fellow professor and colleague, Buzz Schur, in the back row, whose brainchild this was. So welcome to the Rudman Center here at the University of New Hampshire Franklin Pierce School of Law. The Rudman Center provides experiential, curricular, and financial support to law students who are interested in public service. And we also present public programming like today's event that aligns with our mission. We are so pleased to partner with the ACLU of New Hampshire to offer this series on civil liberties and the presidency. Today, we're very fortunate to welcome Andrew Yang, who announced his candidacy for the Democratic nomination for the presidency in November of 2017. Mr. Yang is an entrepreneur and philanthropist who founded Venture for America, a nonprofit dedicated to creating jobs in struggling American cities. And as I'm sure you know, a central tenet of his campaign is that the United States should adopt a universal basic income and pay every American adult $1,000 a month. Moderating this afternoon's presentation will be Jeanne Hruska of the ACLU. Both the Rudman Center and the ACLU of New Hampshire are nonpartisan, and neither endorses political candidates or parties. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Yang.
Sorry for the pause, but I'm here. Hey, how you doing? Good to see you. Look at this, every step makes a sound. Or at least it did for a minute. Hello, everyone. It's so good to be back in New Hampshire. Woo! So when I say back in New Hampshire, I actually went to high school here. I don't know if you knew that. I went to Phillips Exeter Academy, graduated in 1992, 2 very formative years. They had me back to speak a few months back, and I was very honest. I showed up and said, I haven't been back here for a long time because I didn't really have a good time here. And then the student body erupted in applause, and I was like, whoa. I don't know if that's the reaction I expected or the administration wants. It's so phenomenal to be with you all. I'm Andrew Yang. I'm running for president. You all knew that, I think. After I graduated from Exeter, I went to Brown University. Anyone here do that? Yes. Always someone, especially in New Hampshire. Didn't know what to do, so I went to law school. You know, wherever we are. And then after law school, I became an unhappy corporate attorney for 5 whole months. And I thought to myself, wow, this job was not the job for me. So I left to start a company that did not work out. How many of you have started a business or organization? So if you have your hand up, you know, 1, how brutally difficult it is, and 2, how whenever anyone asks you how it's going, what do you say? Great. It's going great. Because no one ever wants to hear anything but great. So my little company had its mini rise and maximum fall. My parents told people I was still a lawyer. But I'd been bitten by the bug. I started working at another technology company, and then I became the head of an education company that grew to become #1 in the United States and was bought by a public company in 2009. 2009 was just right after the financial crisis had hit. full force. You remember that time. And I thought I knew why the financial crisis had happened, at least in large part. That all of the smart kids out of Exeter and Brown and Columbia had become Wall Street whiz kids and created these financial instruments that had wound up crashing the economy. And I thought, well, that's a disaster. What can we come up with that would be a better use of their energies and ambitions and talents than becoming Wall Street whiz kids? So the idea I had was that they should move to places like Providence or Detroit or Baltimore or St. Louis or New Orleans and start a business. Now that would be too much because it's not like you could take a 22-year-old and say, hey, start a business in Detroit. Like that's not feasible. But what I thought would be feasible is that they could work at an early stage company in one of those cities, get seasoned for 2 years, contribute, and then maybe start a business. Does that remind anyone of a program that they've heard of? Teach for America, right? It's Teach for America for entrepreneurs. So I thought to myself, ooh, what do you call Teach for America for entrepreneurs? Venture for America. So I started Venture for America. I donated $120,000 of my own money to seed it, and I started calling rich friends and asked them this question: do you love America? The smart among them then said, what does it mean if I say yes? And then I said, at least $10,000. And then 12 of them said, I love America for $10,000. So we had $250,000 or so, and then it grew and grew. Eventually the budget blew past $6 million, helped create several thousand jobs around the country, to the point where I was honored by the Obama administration as an ambassador of entrepreneurship. I spent 7 years running this nonprofit, in large part because I thought that we had better things for our young people to do than head to Wall Street, or now Silicon Valley, or management consulting firms, or I hate to say it in this context, but even big law firms, that there are better things our young people should be building and doing with their energies and talents. So that's been the last 7 years of my life. And how many of you grew up here in New Hampshire? Northeast generally, Midwest, South, West Coast. All right, so I'm like most of you who had your hand up initially. I grew up in upstate New York. I went to high school here, college in Rhode Island, law school in New York, so I had never been to Birmingham, New Orleans, Cleveland. Seeing the gulf between St. Louis and San Francisco, or Michigan and Manhattan, was staggering to me. Where if you take a plane ride between those two places, you feel like you've just traversed dimensions or decades or ways of life, as opposed to just going a few time zones. So I was drinking all this in for 7 years, and then Donald Trump became our president in 2016. How did you all react when that happened? Oh, the gentleman in the back just put his hand over his, like a doe. I had the same reaction. Though it was darker and more serious, I know many of you, some of you probably cried. A few people in this room likely were happy about it because the odds are someone here, supported Donald Trump, was very, very excited about the outcome. But to me, it was a massive red flag for our society, that our country was so desperate that we actually elected a narcissist reality TV star to be our president. So to me, that required some explanation and digging in. And if you turn on cable news right now, what do you get as an explanation as to why Donald Trump's our president? Russia, Facebook, racism, Hillary Clinton, the FBI, some mixture of these things, right? They miss the central driver of his victory. And the central driver of his victory is this: we automated away 4 million manufacturing jobs in Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Missouri, Iowa, all the swing states he needed to win and did win. Now here in New Hampshire, you experienced the loss of your automation job, your manufacturing jobs a little bit earlier. It's like maybe 20, 30 years ago. But in the Midwest and the South, this was relatively recent. And if you dig into the voter district data, you find that there's a straight line up between the adoption of industrial robots in a voting area and the movement to Trump. It's the strongest correlation anyone can find. We're in the third inning of the greatest economic transformation in the history of our country, what experts are calling the fourth industrial revolution. It wiped out 4 million manufacturing jobs, and now it's going to spread to retail, call centers, fast food, truck driving, and on through the economy. How many of you have noticed stores closing where you live here in New Hampshire? And why are those stores closing? One word answer: Amazon. Amazon's soaking up $20 billion in commerce every single year. How much did Amazon pay in taxes last year? Zero. That is the math, New Hampshire. They soak up $20 billion, pay zero in taxes, and 30% of your stores and malls close. What is the most common job here in New Hampshire and around the country? Retail clerk. The average retail clerk is a 39-year-old woman making between $9 and $11 an hour. What is her next opportunity going to be when the store or mall closes? Is there a fulfillment center? When you call a big customer service line and you get the software, the bot, what do you do? 000, human, 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 as fast as possible, right? I do the exact same thing. But in 2 or 3 years, the software is going to sound like this. Hey, Andrew, how's it going? What can I do for you? It'll be seamless, efficient, delightful. You might not even know it's software. What's that going to mean for the 2.5 million Americans who work in call centers right now for a living who make $14 an hour? Yeah, as soon as AI, and you don't even need real AI to do this customer service job. You just need a very sophisticated decision tree and an algorithm that says, okay, this is the next voice prompt you use. That's not real intelligence. That's just a bunch of decisions. The software can actually even detect the changes in the tone of your voice. They can tell if you're getting irritated, and they can go down a different road. You know, if the software should be good enough where it might be better than a human. Because I hate to say this is going to say something about me as a person, but occasionally get irritated at the human. You know what I mean? Yeah, or move on diamond sometimes, you know, I mean, we're all human. When the AI can outperform one call center worker, that doesn't affect one call center worker, that affects possibly hundreds of thousands of call center workers. I spoke at a conference of 70 CEOs in New York City, and I asked them, how many of you are looking at having AI replace your back office call center workers? You know how many hands went up out of 70? 70, all 70. You could actually fire that CEO if they didn't use the software. Think about that for a sec. If the software truly can replace your back office clerical functions, your customer service functions, and you don't use the software, they will fire you in the next quarter because you are not optimizing for your company's bottom line. Driving a truck is the most common job in New Hampshire and 28 other states. There are 3.5 million truckers in this country, and my friends in California are working on trucks that can drive themselves. They say they're closing in. They say they're 98% of the way there. Now, 2% error rate is very, very high. You can't have semi-trucks smashing into things 2% of the time. And the self-driving trucks are really bad at something called snow. Because when the snow covers the highway markings, then the computer's not sure what to do. Because if you think about it, like, what are they picking up? They just like need the highway markings. So how are they going to get the last 2%? Do you remember the first time you watched TV on your cell phone? You remember that feeling? When you were like, wow, we can do that now? So that's 3G. We're in the process of rolling out 5G around the country. And the way that the technologists and engineers think they can get the last 2% is they want to equip the trucks with teleoperating software so that when the truck's not sure what to do, it signals a teleoperator in a warehouse in Nevada. And then the person in Nevada then beams into the truck and plays it like a video game. The truck has cameras on it so that you essentially are in your seat in Nevada and you can just see out the front of the truck as if you're in the cab. And then when the computer's sure what to do, it then says beep, 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 and then you beam back out. What do you think the ratio is going to be between teleoperators in Nevada and the 3.5 million truckers? Maybe 5%, 10%? What's that going to mean for the 3.5 million truckers and the 7 million Americans who work in truck stops, motels, and diners that rely upon the truckers getting out and having a meal? If you're a truck driver, you have to stop after 14 hours. Your truck will actually keep you from going any further so you can go out and take a nap, essentially. The average truck driver is a 49-year-old man. 94% of truckers are men. Average education is high school or 1 year of college. Tens of thousands of them are ex-military. So how do we think this is going to play out? Only 13% of truck drivers are in a union. So if you think there's going to be some grand negotiation, you will be disappointed. 87% of the truckers belong to very small mom and pop businesses. They've taken out personal loans to buy a few trucks. They've hired a few drivers. That's the normal truck driving business. How many of you know a truck driver, so you know what I'm talking about? So again, we're in the third inning of this transformation, and by the time it gets to inning 4, 5, 6, these other issues will start cascading. So I took these issues to Washington, D.C. My first move was not to run for president, because I'm not crazy. So my first move was I took my facts, my figures, my book, my PowerPoint, and I went to our leaders in Washington, D.C., and I said, what are we going to do? The American people don't understand what's happening to us. scapegoating immigrants for issues that immigrants have nothing to do with. And what do you think the folks in Washington, D.C. said to me when I said, what are we going to do? Number one, we cannot talk about that. Number two, we should study that further. And number three, the most common was we must educate and retrain all Americans for the jobs of the future. That sounds pretty responsible, that last one. You can almost be like, oh, we're all set then, and just like walk on out. But I looked at the studies. You all want to guess how effective the government-funded retraining programs were for manufacturing workers? 0 to 15%. How many of you all studied economics like I did? I studied economics at Brown University. All right, so what did our economics textbook say would happen if you got rid of 4 million manufacturing jobs to those workers? They would be retrained, reskilled, move, find new jobs, invisible hand, economy grows. You all remember that, macroeconomics? So then you dig in, okay, what actually happened in real life to the 4 million manufacturing workers? Turns out that half of them left the workforce and never worked again. And of that half, about half filed for disability. And then we saw record surges in suicides and drug overdoses in those communities to the point that American life expectancy has declined for the last 3 years in a row. You all want to know the last time America's life expectancy declined for 3 years in a row? The Spanish flu of 1918, 100 years ago. It took a global pandemic to reduce our life expectancy 3 years in a row, and we are there again now. None of this was in my economics textbook. It did not say you get rid of these jobs, the workers go home, start drinking themselves to death, vote for Donald Trump. Like, none of that was in the book. But that is what happened in real life. And what happened to the manufacturing workers will now happen to the truckers, but even dialed up. Because manufacturing workers, 70% men, more diverse. Truckers, 94% men, and not very flexible. I went to a truck stop. I've been to truck stops. And if you were to say, hey, I'm here to retrain you, they'd be more likely to punch you in the face than sign up. It's just real. A lot of these guys became truck drivers because they didn't want to do anything else. So this is the reality of the situation we're in. And the reason I'm here with you all is that it's up to the people in New Hampshire to take a different vision to the rest of the country as soon as possible. First, a genuine understanding of the scope of our problems, and then second, real solutions. So what am I talking about when I say vision, solutions? If you're here today, at some point you heard this. There's an Asian man running for president who wants to give everyone $1,000 a month. You remember that? Remember the first time you heard that? And the first time you heard that, you were like, ha ha, that's a gimmick, that's too good to be true. But this is a deeply American idea that's been with us since our founding. Thomas Paine was for it. At the very beginning of the country, called it the citizen's dividend. Martin Luther King championed it in the 60s, and it is what he was fighting for when he was assassinated in 1968. In his 1967 book, Chaos Our Community, he said, we need a guaranteed minimum income, not just for African Americans, but for all Americans. Milton Friedman and 1,000 economists endorsed it in the 70s, and it was so mainstream that it passed the US House of Representatives twice in 1971 under Richard Nixon. The Family Assistance Plan would have guaranteed every family a certain income level. And then 11 years later, one state actually passed a dividend where now everyone in that state gets between $1,000 and $2,000 a year, no questions asked. And what state is that? Alaska. And how do they pay for it? Oil. And what is the oil of the 21st century? Technology. Technology, that's right. Data, AI, software. Right now, it just came out that data is more valuable than oil. What they're doing in Alaska with oil money, we can do for everyone in New Hampshire and everyone in the country with technology money. What this would mean is that this would give rural areas a real path forward. It would create over 10,000 jobs right here in New Hampshire, and it would start to recognize the work that we do that right now the market ignores. And what do I mean by that? Right now my wife is at home with our 2 young boys, one of whom is autistic. What is her work valued at every day? 0. What does the market value her work at? 0. And we know that's perverse. We know the work she's doing. I was off the trail for a couple days taking care of our kids. You know what I said after 2 days? Get me back on the presidential trail immediately. And anyone who's a parent knows exactly what I'm talking about. It's the hardest work there is, among the most vital work there is. And we're valuing it at 0. Even the inventor of GDP said this is a terrible measurement of national well-being and we should never use it as that. So what are we doing 100 years later? Following GDP off a cliff. Raise your hand again if you run a business or an organization. Imagine if you had the wrong measurements for your business or organization. That's where we are right now. Self-driving trucks will be great for GDP, terrible for a lot of Americans. So if you wanted to actually measure how we're doing more effectively, what measurement would you actually use instead of something like GDP? Mental health and freedom from substance abuse. That would be, and if you said that got better, then we'd actually be thrilled. educational outcomes, childhood success? How about clean air and clean water? How about income and affordability? Wellness and life expectancy? Again, what good is GDP if your life expectancy is getting shorter? That's like the clearest sign that we're on the wrong track. Criminality, recidivism, reintegration into society. Believe it or not, we have numbers for all of these things. And as your president, it will be my joy to go down the street to the Bureau of Economic Analysis and say, hey, GDP, really old, kind of out of date. We're going to update it to the American scorecard, and then every year at the State of the Union, I will present to you, the American people, how we're doing by the measurements that matter. I'm going to be the first president to use a PowerPoint deck at the State of the Union. And it's going to come up. So this is the plan. This is the vision how we can actually solve the problems that got Donald Trump elected and start to address really the symptoms. Because right now we're all attacking the symptoms and there's a disease, this root cause. And a lot of the disease is this mindset of insecurity and scarcity that has swept our country. Studies have shown that a mindset of financial insecurity actually reduces your functional IQ by 13 IQ points, or 1 standard deviation. So if you have this nagging feeling that this country is getting less intelligent, less optimistic, less reasonable, more subject to bad ideas, we are. Because 78% of us are living paycheck to paycheck. Almost half of us can't afford an unexpected $400 or $500 bill. And in that context, you become subject to much, much lesser decision making. So with your help, we can move the country not left, not right, but forward. That is how we're going to win in 2020. We have to solve the problems that got Donald Trump elected. If you look back on 2015, what did he say? He said, we're going to make America great again. And then what did Hillary say? It's already great. And that did not work. Now, he got the problems right, but his solutions were the opposite of what we need. His solutions were, we're going to build a wall, we're going to turn the clock back, we're going to bring the old jobs back. We have to do the opposite of those things. We have to turn the clock forward. We have to accelerate our economy and society as fast as possible. We have to evolve in how we think about work and value. And I am the ideal candidate for that job because the opposite of Donald Trump is an Asian man who likes math. What does math stand for, New Hampshire?
All right.
Math is an acronym. It stands for Make America Think Harder, and that's what we're going to do. Thank you all so much. Jeanne.
All right, thinking harder, including on civil rights. So we're going to get into Q&A. Before we do that, I am going to take the liberty of being the moderator and ask you the first one. You used the 2 scariest words to me, Amazon and Facebook, which terrify me from a privacy perspective. Yep. So as these corporate giants grow, how do you protect personal privacy?
Does everyone remember getting their data check in the mail?
No.
So again, data is now worth more than oil, and there are certain companies like, oh no, my mic, what did I do? It's the Russians. Oh, look at that, thanks Jeanne, look at that. Yeah, we beat them again. So companies like Facebook and Google and Amazon are profiting to the tune of tens of billions of dollars off of our data. Now, we're very convenience-minded. How many of you have actually read the terms and conditions of those? Oh, you did. That's impressive. You're in the right building. Most of us just simply scroll down and hit click, and then we hope for the best. So what happens is the companies then profit off of our data, and they sometimes sell and resell the data without our knowing, and become rich in the process. So as your president, I'm proposing that our data is ours. We can loan it out to these companies for our convenience, for their convenience. But if we do loan it out to these companies, a few things are true. Number one, we have to be able to undo that lending if we so choose. Number two, we have to know what they're doing with it. And number three, we get a slice of the profits. So this is the plan, our data as a property right. And if you think about it, who else's property should it be but ours? Am I right? So this is the big move we have to make, and I've been endorsed by Elon Musk, Jack Dorsey, Sam Altman, Alexis Ohanian, who's Serena Williams' husband. He's more famous for that. But the techies are lining up behind me because I'm just speaking the truth about what is happening in our society. And some of the techies, the ones who back me, some of the techies are eager to do something about it. Like if you go to them in their office and say, hey, some really bad stuff's going on and your company has something to do with it, like, oh yeah, I feel really bad about it. It's like, hey, do you want to help me fix it? And they sign up. The problem right now is our government is 24 years behind the technology curve. And I can say that authoritatively because we got rid of the Office of Technology Assessment in 1995, 24 years ago. So Congress has literally been flying blind since then. That's why you have these embarrassing questions for the Zuckerbergs of the world. Remember that? He shows up, and it was like a surprise visit. It's like they ask him the dumbest questions, and you're like, you had weeks to prepare for this, and your policy staff like busted out that question after weeks of research. So they're 24 years behind the curve, and the technologists know this. So right now, the technologists have just been dancing around the government like it's a cumbersome, dinosaur. But they've realized now that that has reached its limits, and they're going to come back and try and fix some of the problems. Some of them are jerks and want nothing to do with it. The ones who are jerks, we're going to cram it down their throats.
So while AJ does that, I'm going to have a quick follow-up to this, which is Amazon has been promoting the Ring, which is this doorbell with a little camera on it. So when you click the doorbell, there's a camera, and it records the front step and the sidewalk behind it. So how do you protect the privacy of the person walking across the sidewalk who doesn't know that their image is being captured? So they have no way to call Amazon and say, hey, where's my check? Let's see if you work.
Oh, let's see if I work. Yes. I work. Unknowing, unwitting, unconsented to mass surveillance is going to become an increasing problem in this country. It's already happening in some of our cities. Some of you might not know that, but there are police cameras that are surveilling certain places right now. They're covering it sometimes from the sky, sometimes from lampposts, sometimes from bank windows. Now, there's like a massive trade-off that goes on. I am all for our privacy, and obviously I want our data to be ours. And it's very hard to enforce that if I'm just walking down the street and then there's a camera catching me. On the flip side, we're going to be entering a time when there are more what's called asymmetrical threats, where like a couple of lone wolves can actually do grievous harm, even more grievous than what we've seen in these mass shootings of late. And so the public policy pressure is going to be increasingly to have public surveillance and monitoring. So that's the tension we're in the midst of. To me, you have to try and do the most difficult of things, which is try and draw the line in a way that the public will embrace. Because we have different senses of the privacy that we have. I think if you're in the privacy of your own home, then you expect like, hey, no one should be monitoring me. But if you're walking on a public street and you get caught in a camera, then most of us would say, well, if that's in the public good, then that's something I can accept. So we have to see to it that if there is like a private individual with a camera on their doorbell, that they're not doing anything creepy with it. They're not like using it in a way that's going to hurt someone else's rights. But most of us, I believe, will just be living in a world where we expect if we're walking on a public street, there's a possibility that a camera is recording us.
I would refute that. Questions?
Hi, Mr. Yang. My name is Alex McEntee, and in 3 historic cases being heard on October 8th, the Supreme Court will decide whether a person can be fired from their job just because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. It's the first time our highest court has ever taken up a case on trans rights, and as a genderqueer granite stater, I am protected from these kinds of discrimination, but most LGBTQ plus Americans live in states where they are not. I want to know if you would support the Equality Act, which would add sexual orientation and gender identity to the Civil Rights Act, and if you see any other ways to advance equality.
Thank you. I'm audible. Not only would I sign the Equality Act, make sexual orientation and gender rights enshrined in the Civil Rights Act, I actually thought it already happened, which shows what a bad law student I was. I was literally confused. I was like, that's not already in there? And then when I realized that it wasn't, I was like, wow, we have to get it in there as fast as possible. Now, I think there are other ways that we can protect the rights of LGBTQ individuals in this country. And I was talking to a young gay man who told me that if you're gay, you're more likely to be kicked out of your house as a teenager, you're more likely to be fired from a job, you're more likely to be economically persecuted and marginalized. And so he supported my campaign because he said $1,000 a month would actually be incredibly empowering for people in the LGBTQ community. It would help make them more resilient, help make them more able to change their environments if their home environment or work environment is unaccepting. Because we all know, no matter what we put in our legal code, it does not reach into the hearts and minds and souls of millions of Americans around the country. That the biases will still exist, the hatred will still exist. So we have to do everything we can to change the culture over time, but we also have to give LGBTQ individuals the ability to protect themselves as soon as possible, and that includes some degree of economic freedom as soon as they turn 18 or sooner.
Yeah, would you also protect trans inmates by having accommodations for them and also a third gender marker on, I always say postcards, on passports and stuff like that?
Yes and yes.
Excellent, thank you.
All right, other questions?
Yeah, if you give every adult $1,000 a month, would that cause inflationary pressure on the economy? And number two, if you give someone $1,000 a month who has a drug addiction problem, how do you prevent them from using that money to hurt themselves?
So I joked about the data check. Do you all remember voting for the $4 trillion bailout of Wall Street? Remember anyone saying, like, you know, that it's going to cause inflation or that we don't have the money? Do you remember any of those conversations happening? A tiny bit. When push came to shove, the banks were like, yes, $4 trillion, they get it. So if we had this money in our hands, it would not cause rampant inflation, in part because if you look at what's happened in our economy the last 20 years or so, what has gotten more expensive? Housing, education, and healthcare. Those are the three drivers of inflation in American life. Everything else in your life, if you think about it, clothing, electronics, most food, cars, media, have either gotten cheaper or better. The reason being that all of these consumer items are in competitive fields where then you end up with efficiencies and technology and supply chains and everything else. Housing, education, and healthcare are all not functioning properly for a variety of reasons. Housing, because we have these NIMBY regulations and then you're kept from developing new affordable housing, and the fact that many people feel like they have to live in certain areas in order to access the opportunities that they want. Education, because college has gotten 2.5 times more expensive over the last number of years, even though it's not gotten 2.5 times better. Oh, really? Has it gotten 2.5 times better and I missed it? No, it just got a lot more expensive, and then people feel like they have no choice but to pay for it. So then schools, no offense to the school we're in, but schools don't have a feeling that they have to restrain their costs. They just keep on jacking the price up. And then healthcare, because we have this private insurance industry and profiteering among the drug companies and the device companies. So if you dig into the cause of inflation, it's never that we have lots of buying power and then people raise the prices. What is the most popular restaurant here in town? Barley House. How much does a dinner at Barley House? Well, some of you have very expensive tastes. She was like 12, you're like 30. I'm going to split the... That's for soup. I'm going to split the difference and say it's $20. All right, so after I'm president 2021, thank you, New Hampshire, the Freedom Dividend, which is half named after you, goes out to you all. And then you go to the Barley House to celebrate. And ordinarily your dinner is $20. And then you go in, and this time they bring you the check and it's $30. How do you react? Yeah. Are you like, oh, that's cool. Like, you know, sure, you jacked up your prices 50%. Of course not. You're still cost sensitive. There's still competition. Are they the only restaurant in town? Like, you'd go someplace else and be like, did you also jack your prices up 50%? And then all it takes is one restaurant to not jack their prices up 50% for all the other restaurants to be like, oh, I guess we can't stick it to our consumers this way. Plus, they'd have more business anyway because more people would be going to the Barley House. They'd end up with, so you don't need to jack the prices up to try and if you did, there's still competition in every vertical except for education, healthcare, and housing. So what we do is we put the money into your hands. It ends up creating opportunities at local establishments, right where you work and live. Because where would you actually spend the money in real life?
Grocery store.
Grocery store, farmer's market, car repairs you've been putting off, daycare, Little League signups, healthcare, tuition. Some of the money would float out up to Amazon and the gang. You'd like buy an extra toaster or two. But most of it would stay right here and would create jobs here. So the inflation concern really is a fiction, more or less, because we've been printing money to the banks for a long time. There's not been inflationary pressure except in those 3 areas. What we have to do is we have to bring down the costs in those 3 areas and put money into Americans' hands to be able to account for consumer needs.
The second part of my question?
Oh, the drugs.
Yes.
There are a few things here. Number one, it's not like a lack of money is keeping people from getting their hands on drugs right now. It's not like when you have financial deprivation, you find a way to get the money and the drugs, often through stealing from friends and family and other things that are much more negative. The second thing is many people are struggling with drug addiction and don't have the resources to seek help because rehab is very expensive. The money would go towards treatment as often or more often than it would getting drugs. And if it was going to getting drugs, then at least it would be in a way that's safer and less damaging and criminal than the other ways that sometimes addicts are getting the resources they need.
I want to touch upon reproductive rights, which is something that ACLU voters have asked you. And so thankfully, you've committed to repealing the Hyde Amendment, which is a big step.
Yep.
We took a look at your website. That's worth applauding, on reproductive rights. And you noted that requirements placed by individual states on abortion access should be subject to oversight by a board of doctors, not the whims of legislators. What do you mean by requirements when you say that? Like, what do you envision here?
I'm on the record saying it should not be for a male legislator to determine women's reproductive rights at all. What I said for a while was like, I just want to let women determine. I have a feeling I know what women are going to decide for themselves, and I would support that. But then when I talked to women, they said, look, while that stance in some ways is what we want to hear, you actually have to say you'd be an affirmative champion of women's reproductive rights as fundamental human rights, which I would be. I would enshrine it in our legal system, but I would also be open to adding Supreme Court justices. I know that's controversial, but I would be open to adding Supreme Court justices if it was necessary to protect women's reproductive rights. And then that item on the website, I am generally not for any restrictions, but if there were restrictions that they're using a medical rationale, then it should be doctors presenting that medical rationale, not legislators who are generally doing it as cover for other rationales.
Let's commit to the first part, which is no restrictions.
Oh, I'm for no restrictions.
Let's start there. All right.
So when I first launched my campaign and we were hanging out with the ACLU, they brought me in and they said, hey, let's have you say things, and then we'll use it to get other candidates to say things. And I was like, sure, because I essentially endorse the ACLU in just about every stand. It's like there's nothing they could spring on me where I'd be like, oh, I'm not so sure about that. I'd be like, yes,
really?
Yes,
No. I want to talk about this because you've said this on the record multiple times now. There are a couple commitments that we have got other candidates to make that you have not made.
I want to hear these.
So here's the opportunity.
Oh, yeah. If a question comes up, that's one of those.
Will you commit during your presidential tenure to reducing mass incarceration by 50%?
Oh, so the only reason I haven't said yes to that is I don't like putting numbers.
12 other candidates have.
But I would be for reducing mass incarceration in myriad ways by any means possible. But committing to a hard number just seems like a little bit rash because you'd have to be able to look into things. So I guess I'm going to be the person that, you're right, did not satisfy that particular purpose. But I'm all for reforming our punitive criminal justice system and our system of mass incarceration. It's terrible. And I want to share something a corrections officer here in New Hampshire said to me. He said to me, we should pay people to stay out of jail because it's so costly when they're in jail. Like right now, we're trying to be clever and saying like, oh, we're going to save money. We just end up spending the money in much more expensive and punitive and inhuman ways. So by investing in ourselves, making our families and communities stronger, we'll end up saving money anyway. That's the way you reduce mass incarceration over time. The other thing is when someone comes out of jail, if they're getting $1,000 a month, first they'll be like, wow, things have changed since I went in. But then people will be happy to see them when they get to their neighborhoods. They'll be like, hey, you're home, and you brought a dividend with you. It's like, yes, I did. Do you think we could get recidivism down in that society? Heck yes. Because then they instead of to stay out of jail, it's like, wait a minute, I'm out of jail, I get the dividend. I go to jail, I do not get the dividend. How about I stay out of jail? So this is how we get mass incarceration down over time. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say the commitment does matter because otherwise that all sounds lofty and good, but it doesn't sound like a firm commitment.
Yeah, no, I would commit to it in spirit, but I just can't commit to a hard number in like a certain time frame. You have to actually look at the reality on the ground. Thank you for raising something. I was like, what did I not commit to? And it's like, oh, that. Oh, yeah. That's like, oh, yeah, I could commit to that.
Hi. There are a bunch of us in this room that went to Homestead, Florida. We asked many of the candidates that while they were down there for the debate to go over and see the child detention center in Homestead. It has since been closed, which is great, but they closed it seems, because of the hurricane plans or lack thereof. I saw an article yesterday. They're going to open it again in October for these children. We also don't know where any of those children are. I don't even know what question to ask about this, but would you comment on it?
Oh, please. I'm the parent of 2 young children. I can't imagine what it'd be like for those kids. I mean, we're traumatizing these kids for life. And we're traumatizing these kids for life and the parents for life because our government's just simply not up to the challenge to treating these migrants in a human and humane way. We have, at this point, what one of my friends called something like government by no one, where you look up and you say, okay, who's responsible for the inhuman conditions at the border? And you look around and it'd be very hard to identify an individual who has that responsibility. So at this point, we just go all the way to the top of the chain, which is the president. And in this case, the president seems very happy to take responsibility. But this is not the way it should be. Like, we need to have more actual flexibility and humanity in the way we administer our laws and policies at the ground level. I've been an operator of many significant national organizations, and most always the action's happening on the ground. And what I mean by that is when the migrant actually shows up and you have the family in front of you, like, what decision do you make? Where do you bring the person? Who's the case manager? Right now, we just don't have the resources or the humanity to be able to treat these migrants in a way that's consistent with our values. And that's not, unfortunately, just at the border. That's in like other aspects of our life too. That's in our prison system. That's to some extent the way we get treated as citizens in some instances. In some instances, it's in our schools, our hospitals. The migrant crisis is a manifestation of the fact that we've all become now subject to this inhuman, punishing system that treats us all as inputs into this greater machine. And that's what we need to change. But certainly, as your president, the last thing I would do is separate families at the border. I'm the son of immigrants myself and a parent, and any American who sees this is appalled by it and disgusted by it.
So there's one immigration issue here in New Hampshire that I want to touch upon that I know activists have been working on, which is Customs and Border Patrol has been running immigration checkpoints up and down New Hampshire's highways because their jurisdiction is 100 miles from the border, including from the coast. And if you take 100 miles west from the seacoast and down from the Canadian border, pretty much all of New Hampshire is within their jurisdiction to run checkpoints. So would you commit to reducing their jurisdiction to, say, 25 miles? Something less than 100?
100 miles seems excessive to me, so I would commit to reducing it to something that seemed more reasonable, yes.
Thanks, Jeanne. Hi, Ms. Jeanne. My name is Joseph, and first off, I want to thank you for coming here today and sharing your vision and goals for the country with us. I have a 2-part question for you. Jeanne actually asked one of my questions, so I have a follow-up to one of the things that she said. But my first one is, according to a 2018 survey, there's over 12,000 people that are under departmental supervision. And assuming they had a mother, father, a sibling, and a child, that means that's over 60,000 people that are affected by the criminal justice system in New Hampshire. So what does your criminal justice reform vision look like for New Hampshire? And the second part is, if you won't commit to 50% reduction in mass incarceration, what is an acceptable number for you?
Very good.
So are we talking about people that are separated from their families, like when you say under the jurisdiction, is this?
Who are incarcerated.
Incarcerated, oh, in our corrections officers. Oh. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Is it parole, probation?
Under departmental supervision covers everything from being locked up in the state prison all the way to probation, parole.
So number one, we have to get rid of private prisons that have a profit motivation. And we all know makes no sense to have a prison that actually profits from recidivism and shoddy treatment of inmates, which are clearly the financial incentives that would happen in that environment. Number two, we have to get rid of the punitive cash bail system that ends up criminalizing people for being poor. And I don't know how many of the people here in New Hampshire are in jail because of that cash bail, but I'm sure it's at least in the hundreds, maybe even more, thousands. The third thing we have to do is try to reintegrate people into society more effectively by putting real resources to work when they come out, which is the freedom dividend. And the fourth thing is to try and measure the prisons based on their successful rehabilitation. Because right now, those are not the rewards that are in place for these wardens or these officers. And when I talked to this corrections officer here, he'd done the work for decades, and he talked about how incredibly expensive and wasteful the current system is, but how it's also not making people any stronger or able to return to society. This is going to be a very tall order because it's very hard to transform cultures of organizations that have been operating for decades, but that is the challenge in front of us. And I'm happy to say that Americans now recognize just how broken our mass incarceration system is and how much progress we need to make. So on the number side, I'm going to say this is not that helpful, but I'm just going to give, this is the signal of my thinking. I'm going to mass pardon everyone who's in jail for a nonviolent marijuana-related offense. And then I'm going to high five them on the way out. Because it makes no sense to have people in jail for something that's legal in other parts of the country. And we know that the vast majority of the people in jail for that are going to be African-American men, typically. So these are some of the things that I'm just letting you know I would do. I would have to dig into the numbers to find a number that I would be able to commit to in a particular time frame. But rest assured, the last thing that Andrew Yang wants to do is imprison people. I want to try and make our society stronger and more whole.
On that, because I think this is a connection to that, which is one of the ways to have people still connected to their community even while incarcerated, and therefore increase successful reentry, is to allow people to vote while incarcerated. So here's the other commitment you have not made for the ACLU.
Fire away.
Which is enabling people while incarcerated to vote.
So I am 100% on board, with the exception of whether you deprive someone else of their ability to vote. Like if you're in jail because, for example, you murdered someone and they can't vote, then you should not be able to vote. But barring that, anyone incarcerated should be able to vote. So I'm 100% on board, except with that caveat that if you deprive someone else of their ability to vote permanently, then you've lost yours while you're in jail.
Hi, Mr. Yang. My name is Jennifer Chmielewski, and I wanted to see what your thoughts were on the disability system. A lot of people, myself included, have waited years to get onto the disability program, and they have been denied many, many times. And I have found that the average is 3 to 4 years to take to get onto the disability system. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Our disability system right now is in many ways the worst of all worlds, where if you have a genuine disability, then you have to fight through this incredible ocean of red tape. It's so extreme now that there's a giant legal industry devoted to helping people file disability claims. And the single biggest success marker as to whether you get approved is whether you hired a lawyer. And so, So this is what I mean by the worst of all worlds. Like, we've created this incredible system of distrust where it's like, if you apply for disability, we're going to make you prove it over and over again. We're going to deny you. We're going to deny you. And then if you do get disability, you're put in a position, and I just talked to someone who was in this position, where if you did want to work 10, 12, 15 hours a week, you can't do so without risk of losing your benefits. It becomes this binary thing, and then you say, well, look, well, I'm certainly not going to risk my future stream of income to work or volunteer for a certain period of time, so I guess I'm not going to do that. What we need to do is trust our people, first by putting $1,000 a month into everyone's hands unconditionally. Then you would end up changing the incentives for everyone who's on that dividend. And then if people apply for disability, then you know it's likely to be very serious because they're applying for disability and have to go through this process, often for a lower marginal amount of money if they're already getting this $1,000 floor. But right now, our disability system is rewarding, unfortunately, people who hire lawyers and the lawyers themselves, no offense. But legally representing disability plaintiffs generates tens, even hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And disability transfers have become an increasingly large proportion of our economy, between 6 and 20% of working age adults are on disability in certain parts of the country. Now, I'm all for someone who's disabled getting money to live. Like, I'm all for that. What I'm not for is, again, this punishing system of red tape that ends up excluding people like you who need it and rewarding the lawyers and the people that hire them. No, they'd get it. They'd get the freedom dividend as well. And then if you had the disability, then it's in addition. Like, everyone's entitled to the freedom dividend.
People with disability would be on disability, and they wouldn't be because they'll get less.
Well, you'd be more likely to only be applying if you're genuinely disabled, because you're looking at the, like, your incentives change if you're already getting the $1,000 a month flat.
So there was a really good question submitted that I want to make sure we ask, which is an economic justice question, which is in addressing climate change, how do we make sure that the people who are protected from climate change aren't only the rich? How do you make sure that low-income, marginalized people are also protected when it comes to climate change?
How many of you saw the last debate? So you remember I staked out the third position in American politics. Position number 1, we need to fight climate change. Position number 2, climate change is a hoax and not a problem. And then Andrew Yang's new third position, it's worse than we think. We're doomed, and we need to move people to higher ground. Now, that was obviously within the context of a 60-second soundbite in debate, but I own it in the sense that it certainly shows the level of seriousness with which I take climate change. It is an existential threat, and it's worse than anyone seems to be acknowledging in political life. A study just came out from the UN last week that said that we're going to be fine if 90% of the world goes vegetarian immediately. That seems like a relatively large condition. Because I think we're all going to, some of us are going to go out and have a burger. Greenland, at Barley House. Greenland, Donald Trump's new apple of his eye. But Greenland just came out with a study saying that it is melting at the rate projected in 2050 now. It's melting at a rate 31 years sooner. So if you look at the countermeasures we're talking about on climate change, they are almost certainly not going to be enough, especially when you look globally at the fact that the United States is only 15% of global emissions, 85% is outside of our borders, and a lot of that's happening in the developing world. What's happening in the developing world is this. China's investing hundreds of billions of dollars in renewable energy, and then they're going to Africa and saying, hey, Africa, would you like a power plant? It burns coal. Isn't that fantastic? And then Africa's like, sure, we'll take it. So what China's doing is they're dumping the dirty energy in Africa and other parts of the world. And if you're Africa, your incentives are just to get the cheapest, generally dirtiest energy possible. So for the United States to say, don't use that coal plant, what would we have to do? We'd have to give them something better and cheaper that can outcompete the coal plant in Africa. So this is what we should be doing. The only difference between me and the other candidates is I want to be more aggressive. I don't want to just reduce emissions. I want to reforest vast tracts of American land and go to other countries and say, hey, mind if we plant tons of trees here? We'll pay for it. I want to reforest the oceans. Now, what do I mean by that? You have to plant kelp, marine permaculture arrays underneath the ocean and try and repopulate marine ecosystems. It's expensive, but it's a lot cheaper than catastrophe. So these are the moves that we have to be making. We can't just have this fantasy where it's like, if we just reduce emissions and recycle, it's going to do the trick. It will not do the trick. We're going to have to actually go aggressively the other direction in terms of being proactive.
So on that, going back to the question, in terms of an economic perspective, move everybody to higher ground. Rich people can afford to move themselves to higher ground.
So what move people to higher ground meant is that when there's a natural disaster, Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, Hurricane Harvey in Houston, what happens? The poor suffer. Who are the poor? Communities of color, most of the time. If you were an affluent person in New Orleans, you got in your SUV and you freaking drove away. And if you didn't have an SUV, then you were stuck and you wound up literally underwater. So when I said move people to higher ground and make our communities more resilient, what I meant was if you put $1,000 a month into people's hands, then you bring up the ratio of people that have the economic means to be able to leave and protect themselves. We pretty much have to own the fact that the government is going to be unable to protect all of our citizens in all of the instances of climate change, from Midwestern flooding to coastal problems to hurricanes to the rest of it, to giant forest fires. We know our government's not up to the challenge of addressing all of these things. The best way the government can protect us is by giving us the economic means to protect ourselves. And $1,000 a month would go much, much further in communities of color in poor areas of New Orleans than it would in, let's say, an affluent suburb in another part of that state.
Forgive me if you've already addressed this issue, but do you foresee drastically, well, I would like to see the military budget cut significantly. Is that any part of your platform?
And we're spending $750 billion or so that we know of. We spent trillions of dollars on these armed conflicts that had unclear benefits, cost thousands of lives. So my proposal is that we take a significant proportion of that $750 billion a year that we spend and move it to infrastructure spending, which would include making it more renewable and sustainable. Right now, our infrastructure gets a D, and we can see that it's decaying around us. So the great thing about transferring some of this military defense spending to infrastructure is that infrastructure has much higher economic return and will create a lot of the same jobs and type of activity that the military spending does right now. Because military defense spending, they've been very smart. They've spread it out in every congressional district, and now it's politically bulletproof. Because everyone says if you cut that, it's going to cut jobs in that district. So we have to replace those jobs with infrastructure jobs.
Hi, thank you. What specific steps would you take to maneuver a proposition that would oppose Citizens United, that would move it to the side? I mean, and the second thing is that what would you, from a policy perspective, what position would you take about people working in government then turning that opportunity into money, monetizing it on the other side? And what would you do to stop that? Because it's really about, when you're talking about climate change, there it is, Yeah. That's the foundation of that is corruption. And so I'm wondering what position.
How do we fight corruption? I love it. What's your name?
Susie.
Susie, this is the question. The question on so many people's minds here is we know our government has completely been overrun by money. That this country at this point is just following the almighty dollar. So how do you change that? And the reason why I'm so excited about this question, Susie, is that's why we're here today. That's why New Hampshire is so magical. Go ahead and count up how many presidential candidates you've seen so far, and then hold a hand up or two hands as to what number you're at. Look at that, you're at 10, Susie, that's incredible. Some of you are actually, you're past 10. Now, why the heck is there such an endless parade of presidential candidates here in New Hampshire? Because this is one of the only places in the country where democracy actually works the way it's supposed to. I've done the math. Do you know how many Californians each of you is worth? 1,000 Californians. There are 160 people here from New Hampshire. I'm guessing you're mostly New Hampshire. In this room, that's 160,000 Californians. That's 4 football stadiums worth of Californians. New Hampshire is the only place where the will of the people can actually counter the money. Now, here's another trap we get into. We're flooded with corporate money, and then we say, oh, let's put new rules in place. Let's put new rules in place that'll keep the lobbying money out. It probably will not. So what are we going to do? We're going to wash the lobbyist cash away with people-powered money. I'm with you all today. I'm tied for 5th in the presidential race. I'm one of only 9 candidates to make the fall debates. And I have done this with an average donation of only $24. My fans are even cheaper than Bernie's. And I understand the distinction between hunting for votes and hunting for money. And this is, I want to explain the situation our legislators are in. So the legislators go around and get some votes from people. Let's say 10,000 voters. And then they go somewhere else and get the money. And then if you have a choice between the voters and the money, you end up following the money over time. Because the money is so much more real and measurable and concrete, and the meals are better, and it's like fancier. And so the legislators end up just getting drawn in this direction. And I have friends from Exeter who went to Capitol Hill with the best of intentions, swore up and down they would never become a lobbyist. Guess what they're doing now? Lobbying. That's right. That system will chew up even the most idealistic people and turn them into lobbyists. So how do you change this? What you do is you align the people and the money. And how do you align the people and the money? You issue 100 democracy dollars to every citizen in the United States that you can only give to candidates and campaigns. That would wash out the lobbyist money by a factor of 5 to 1. Then if I get 10,000 voters behind me and you give me your democracy dollars, that's $1 million. And then when the lobbyist comes with their check for 50,000, you say, I don't care about your 50,000. I'm getting $1 million from the people. This is the way my campaign operates right now, and I love it. I can ignore the moneyed interest. I can ignore the corporations. I can do that because I have almost 250,000 donors at $24 a pop. I've raised $3 million in the last 6 weeks. But the average legislator is not in that position. And so what we have to do is we have to align the legislator's interest and the people's interest as fast as possible. That is the only way, because if you put in new rules, we all know how this country works. I could put any rule in, and what's going to happen? The money's going to creep around it. Money's going to find its way around it. So in terms of ending the revolving door between government and lobbying, I committed as president to say I will never take a dime for any personal profit from anyone after I leave office. I will instruct my team to do the same, because it's corrupt for a president to take $250,000 for a paid speech after they leave office. The natural temptation is to say, well, this person might give me $250,000 for a speech after I leave office, so maybe I should go easy on him. Maybe I should go easy on the company. We have to know that our president only works for us, and the only way to know that is for them to say there's going to be no personal gain from anything I do. And this is the way it used to be. It used to be that a president, after they left office, they freaking went to the farm. They just, you know what I mean? They just sat there and wrote. They didn't join corporate boards. They didn't give speeches for $250,000. This is like a modern invention. It's a terrible invention. It has ended up corrupting our political culture over time, because if the president does it, then certainly the secretary of X and Y can do it. Certainly like Congressman X can do it. We have to start at the top, set the rules, and this could include giving legislators a raise. Say, look, it's a one-way street. You can never lobby. You can't do anything in industry for money, but we're going to give you like a bit of like a package so that you're not going to have financial deprivation. That would be a fantastic use of public funds, because if we knew that our legislators actually work for us and our president worked for us, wouldn't we accept that they get paid a little bit more? And these are the rules that I would make after I'm out of office, because I don't care about the money. I'll be like, look, the president after me can get a little bit more. I just want to shut the door on the corrupt revolving door that is destroying our society.
Real quick, because this is very New Hampshire relevant. The other side to that is gerrymandering.
Yeah.
Which
it just came up yesterday, right?
In terms of taking power away from people, we had an anti-gerrymandering bill vetoed here in New Hampshire recently.
Yeah, with such like a farce of a rationale. What was his rationale? Such garbage.
But drawing district lines is obviously state specific. But as president, what would you do to fight gerrymandering?
I just yesterday came out with this pro-democratic reform packages. So you need to have an independent commission drawing district lines, just like they were suggesting here in New Hampshire. And his rationale being, you have to have state legislators do their jobs. The legislators could sign off on the redistricting. That is their job. Their job is not to frankly make it easier for themselves to get voted back into office, which is what his suggestion was. So among the democratic reforms I'm proposing, democracy dollars, ranked choice voting. It would be such a political revolution in New Hampshire if you all had ranked choice voting. It'd be so much fun, so much more fun.
What is it?
What's ranked choice voting? So right now, you're in a position, we're all in a position, where you're afraid to waste your vote. Because if you vote for someone you really like, but you don't think they're going to win, then you're like, I don't want to do that. So with ranked choice voting, you can say, I want to vote that person first, and then I vote the other person second, the other person third. And then if your top choice doesn't make it, then your vote gets counted to the second, so you never waste your vote. This ends up making your true preferences more aligned with the way you're voting. It also promotes different parties coming up. It makes incumbents less likely to win, because right now you have this incumbent who generally has a huge financial and reputational advantage, and then the only person that has a chance to compete with them is the person from the other major party. So what does that do? It means that you only have two parties forever. And in other countries where you have ranked choice voting, you end up with more different candidates and different parties coming up over time, which is a more healthy democracy. So that's a major democratic reform. But I couldn't agree with you more. Gerrymandering is a terrible problem, and I would support an independent commission, bipartisan, to redistrict, not just on the state level, but also federally.
Does the democracy plan include automatic voter registration?
Yes, it does.
Last question.
Boo. Don't worry, I'll stick around and take some selfies, I think. I don't know what my schedule looks like. I have 10 minutes. Oh, no, it sucks.
I wanted
You have to come to another event. I've got 8 other events in the state. Make you jump a little bit. Today. No, not just all today.
I wanted to talk to you about your journalism policies. They seem to address the lack of funding now that ads have kind of left paper journalism.
Yep.
But it doesn't really seem to address the consolidation that's happened there. So I'm wondering if you would consider encouraging the repeal of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 that kind of consolidated the media down, and reintroducing the FCC fairness doctrine that kind of allows more diversity of the issues that were presented. The public owns the airwaves, and we're not really using that pressure to bring the media to like allow spots for candidates rather than the money just running. And I think also Julian Assange was a perfect example of a journalist that if they have an unpopular perspective, the money can be cut off and worse. So I'm hoping you'll address these issues.
Thank you. I'm a huge believer in local journalism. Right now, about 1,200 newspapers have gone out of business around the country. How many of you know of a local paper in New Hampshire that went out of business? Probably some, right? So why are these newspapers disappearing? Because they used to rely upon classified ads for their money, and then the classified ads all went to the internet and Craigslist. There was no real replacement for these local papers, so they started to die. Now, studies have shown that democracy functions worse if you don't have a local paper, which makes sense, because how the heck would you vote on local issues if you don't have a local paper? What happens in an area where you don't have a local paper is everyone just votes along party lines, and then you become more polarized and less functional over time. So if you believe in democracy, you would believe in local journalism. The problem is that if classified ads don't work, then you need to find new revenue models. So I have a proposal. I have 3 or 4 proposals funding local journalists in different ways. But one is the fact that many communities could support a local paper if that paper didn't have to put up double-digit profit margins because it was, for example, bought by a hedge fund that had consolidated them, et cetera, et cetera. That we need more cooperative ownership models. We need public-private partnerships. We need to house some of these papers in libraries because many libraries already have a community bulletin board that can serve this role. So the goal is to make it so that you have different models of journalism that can support, really support a vibrant democracy. Now the rules that you're suggesting, I agree with you that right now the rules have not served journalism well from the FCC. And when you talk about the airwaves, at this point, it's less the airwaves than it is the internet, I think. So this is going to be a massive challenge for a long time to come, but I'm open to what you're describing, which is trying to go even deeper into the journalism industry to support local papers and different points of view. Because in the absence of that, we all see what's happening around us right now. There are 3 giant media conglomerates that are controlling more and more of the media. You have hedge funds that are buying up more and more papers than rolling them together. And you know what's the first thing to go in that roll-up? Journalists. You know what they do is they have like one story and then they just trot it out to all the things and local news starts to die. This to me is one of the most overlooked problems of the 21st century economy. That we're so brainwashed by the market where we think if the local paper can't make money, then the local paper should disappear. And then you think to yourself, well, wait, what does the world look like without those local papers? Without those local papers, you wind up with a disintegrating democracy. If you believe in democracy, you have to believe in local journalism. And if you believe in local journalism, you have to put some money into it. You have to put some public money into it. I have a confession. I say that to local journalists, and they tend to like it.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. We will be having more of these events, so if you don't already, please follow the ACLU of New Hampshire and the Warren B. Rudman Center on Twitter. We will keep you posted. And I believe Andrew is going to stick around for a few minutes.
I will stick around for a few minutes. Thank you, New Hampshire.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, New Hampshire. You're incredible.